Mr. Henn, for the cold-blooded murder of Sasha Mitchell, you are sentenced to life without parole. You will die in prison.
In a narrow service corridor on Deck 4, behind a maintenance door passengers never see, 17-year-old Sasha Mitchell lay crumpled against cold metal, her blonde hair matted with blood, her eyes frozen in an expression of betrayal that would haunt every crime scene photo. The blunt force trauma to her skull had been delivered with such vicious intent that bone fragments cracked beneath the skin. The coroner would later testify she remained conscious for nearly 2 minutes after the first blow, aware that her stepfather was beating her to death with a deck chair leg. A Valentine's family cruise, a mother's worst nightmare, and the start of a federal murder investigation that would expose secrets far darker than anyone on that ship could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this absolutely devastating case, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, because we cover cases like this every single week, and we need your support to keep bringing you these stories. Also, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from right now, because our community spans the entire globe, and we love hearing from you. Now, let's get back to the horror that unfolded on the Caribbean Princess, because what happened in those early morning hours would test the limits of FBI interrogation techniques and reveal a killer hiding in plain sight. The alarm was raised at 6:47 a.m. when a crew member named Roberto Vasquez, a maintenance engineer from the Philippines who had worked on cruise ships for 14 years, opened the service corridor door to check a reported water leak and instead found Sasha's body. His scream echoed through the crew quarters, bringing 2 other staff members running, and within minutes the ship's security chief, a former Miami-Dade police detective named Marcus Williams, had secured the scene and placed an emergency call to the United States Coast Guard. Because the ship was in international waters but registered in the United States and carrying American passengers, the case immediately fell under federal maritime jurisdiction, triggering a protocol that brought Special Agent John Belmont of the FBI's Miami field office via helicopter to the ship within 90 minutes. Belmont, a 19-year veteran of the Bureau with a specialty in maritime crimes and a reputation for extracting confessions from suspects who thought they were too smart to break, landed on the ship's helipad at 8:23 a.m., and by 8:45 a.m., he was standing over Sasha's body, studying the crime scene with the cold, analytical eye that had closed 47 murder cases in his career. The corridor was barely 4 feet wide, a utilitarian space of exposed pipes and electrical conduits that smelled of industrial cleaner and machine oil, and it was clear immediately that Sasha had not died where she lay. The blood spatter patterns on the walls told Belmont that the actual murder had occurred somewhere else, somewhere with more room for the killer to swing the weapon, and that the body had been dragged here in a panicked attempt to hide it. Belmont noted the defensive wounds on Sasha's forearms, the broken fingernails that suggested she had fought back, and, most tellingly, the small fragments of clear glass embedded in her scalp wounds, glinting under his flashlight like tiny diamonds. The ship's doctor, who had pronounced Sasha dead at the scene, estimated time of death between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., placing the murder during the quietest hours of the cruise when most passengers were asleep and the crew was minimal. Belmont immediately ordered the ship to remain anchored, transforming the Caribbean Princess from a vacation vessel into a floating crime scene, and he instructed his team to begin processing every inch of the ship's public areas, focusing on security camera footage and passenger manifests. By 10:15 a.m., as the sun climbed higher over the turquoise Mexican waters and other passengers began asking why they hadn't docked in Cozumel as scheduled, Belmont's team had identified the victim as Sasha Mitchell, a junior at Coral Gables Senior High School in Miami, traveling with her mother, Jennifer Mitchell, and her stepfather, Thomas Henn. The cabin steward assigned to their suite on Deck 7 reported that he had seen all three family members at dinner in the main dining room the previous evening, and that they had seemed to be enjoying themselves, laughing over the Valentine's Day surf and turf special. But when Belmont's agents knocked on the door of cabin 7042 at 10:30 a.m. to deliver the death notification, they found Jennifer Mitchell alone, hysterical with worry because her daughter had not returned to the cabin the previous night, and she had been searching for her since 7 a.m. Thomas Henn, Jennifer told the agents through her tears, had gone to help look for Sasha, checking the teen clubs and the pool deck, and he had left their cabin around 8 a.m. This information immediately triggered Belmont's investigative instincts because, in his experience, family members who were innocent didn't leave their spouse alone during a crisis, and he radioed his team to locate Thomas Henn immediately and bring him to the ship's security office for questioning. Thomas Henn was found at 11:02 a.m. on Deck 10, near the forward observation lounge, sitting alone at a table with a cup of coffee, staring out at the ocean. The two FBI agents who approached him later described his demeanor as eerily calm, almost detached, as though he were a tourist simply enjoying the view rather than a stepfather whose stepdaughter was missing. When they informed him that Sasha had been found deceased and that Special Agent Belmont needed to speak with him immediately, Thomas showed what the agents characterized as appropriate shock, his face going pale, his hand trembling as he set down his coffee cup. But there was something about his eyes, Agent Patricia Reeves would later testify, something cold and calculating behind the mask of grief that made her skin crawl. Thomas accompanied the agents without resistance, asking repeatedly what had happened, how Sasha had died, whether Jennifer knew yet, his questions tumbling out in a performance of concern that Reeves found too rehearsed, too perfectly calibrated. By 11:20 a.m., Thomas Henn was sitting across from Special Agent John Belmont in the ship's security office, a cramped room lined with monitors showing live feeds from hundreds of security cameras throughout the vessel. And the interrogation that would span the next 8 hours and shatter Thomas's carefully constructed lies was about to begin. Belmont began with the standard sympathetic approach, offering Thomas water, expressing condolences for the family's loss, establishing rapport before tightening the noose. He asked Thomas to walk him through the previous evening, starting with dinner, and Thomas complied readily, describing the Valentine's Day meal in the main dining room, the lobster tail Jennifer had ordered, the chocolate lava cake they had shared for dessert. According to Thomas's first alibi, after dinner around 9:30 p.m., the family had returned to their cabin, where Sasha had said she wanted to go to the teen disco on Deck 9, a supervised club for passengers ages 15 to 17. Thomas claimed he and Jennifer had agreed, and that Sasha had left the cabin around 10 p.m., promising to be back by midnight. He stated that he and Jennifer had watched a movie in the cabin, some romantic comedy that Jennifer had picked, and that they had both fallen asleep around 11:30 p.m. When Sasha hadn't returned by 1 a.m., Thomas said Jennifer had woken him in a panic, and they had both gone looking for their daughter, searching the teen disco, the pool deck, even the all-night buffet. This search, according to Thomas, had lasted until nearly 4 a.m., when, exhausted and terrified, they had returned to their cabin to wait and hope Sasha would show up. It was a plausible story, delivered with just the right amount of emotional distress, and if Belmont had been a less experienced investigator, he might have accepted it. But Belmont had already reviewed the security footage, and he knew that Thomas Henn was lying. The security cameras told a very different story, one that Belmont had watched 3 times before bringing Thomas in for questioning, making notes of every contradiction. The footage from the main dining room confirmed that the family had eaten dinner together, and the timestamp showed they had left the restaurant at 9:41 p.m. Cameras in the Deck 7 corridor showed all 3 of them entering cabin 7042 at 9:53 p.m. At 10:08 p.m., Sasha emerged from the cabin alone, wearing a short black dress and heels, and headed toward the elevators, consistent with Thomas's claim that she went to the teen disco. But here was where Thomas's story fell apart, because the cameras showed that Jennifer Mitchell never left the cabin after 9:53 p.m., meaning there was no joint search of the ship for Sasha. Even more damning, the cameras captured Thomas leaving cabin 7042 alone at 2:47 a.m., walking quickly toward the aft stairwell with his hands in his pockets, and then returning to the cabin at 3:24 a.m., this time walking slowly, his right hand gripping his left wrist in a gesture that body language experts would later identify as self-comforting behavior associated with extreme stress or guilt. And there was one more detail, one that Belmont had zoomed in on and enhanced, a detail that would become the linchpin of the prosecution's case. In the footage of Thomas returning to his cabin at 3:24 a.m., his left wrist was clearly visible, and on it was a distinctive gold Rolex watch with a black face and a Jubilee bracelet, a watch that Thomas's own mother-in-law would later identify as having belonged to Thomas's deceased father. A watch that Thomas wore constantly as a memorial to the man who had raised him. That watch, Belmont already knew from the preliminary forensic report, was now missing its crystal face, and fragments of that crystal were currently being analyzed in the FBI's forensic lab in Quantico because they matched the glass found embedded in Sasha Mitchell's shattered skull. Belmont let Thomas finish his initial narrative without interruption, nodding sympathetically, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, giving the suspect every opportunity to lock himself into a story that could later be demolished with evidence. When Thomas concluded his account with a description of returning to the cabin at 4:01 a.m. after the fruitless search, his voice breaking as he described Jennifer's tears and their mutual terror about Sasha's disappearance, Belmont set down his pen and looked directly into Thomas's eyes. "Thomas, I appreciate you walking me through last night, and I know this is incredibly difficult for you," Belmont said, his tone still warm, but with an edge of steel creeping in. "But I need to clarify a few timeline issues, because we have security cameras throughout this ship, and they've given us a pretty complete picture of everyone's movements." Thomas's expression didn't change, but Belmont saw his jaw tighten infinitesimally, a micro-expression of stress that confirmed the agent's suspicion that Thomas knew exactly where this conversation was headed. Belmont opened a laptop on the table between them and pulled up the security footage from the Deck 7 corridor. "This is from last night, and I'm going to show you several clips. And I want you to tell me if you see anything that might help us understand what happened to Sasha," Belmont said, framing it as though Thomas were a witness rather than a suspect, maintaining the cooperative atmosphere even as he prepared to spring the trap. The first clip showed the family returning to their cabin at 9:53 p.m., and Thomas nodded, confirming that matched his recollection. The second clip showed Sasha leaving alone at 10:08 p.m., and again Thomas nodded, saying that was when she went to the disco. But when Belmont played the third clip, the one showing Thomas leaving the cabin alone at 2:47 a.m., Thomas's entire demeanor shifted. His shoulders stiffened, his hands gripped the armrests of his chair, and his eyes darted to the door of the security office as though calculating whether he could leave. "Thomas, that's you leaving your cabin at 2:47 a.m., approximately 6 hours after Sasha left," Belmont said, pausing the video with Thomas frozen in the frame. "But you told me that you and Jennifer searched for Sasha together starting around 1 a.m. Can you help me understand this discrepancy?" Thomas's second alibi came tumbling out in a rush of words, a clear sign that he was improvising rather than recounting actual events. He claimed he had misspoken in his first account, that the timeline was confused in his mind because of the stress and lack of sleep. What had actually happened, Thomas now stated, was that Jennifer had woken him At 1 a.m., worried about Sasha, but he had convinced her to go back to sleep, assuring her that Sasha was probably just hanging out with new friends and had lost track of time. He had dozed off again himself, Thomas said, but had woken at 2:45 a.m. and decided to go look for Sasha on his own so Jennifer could rest. He claimed he had searched the teen disco, which was closed, and then checked the 24-hour buffet, the casino, and several other public areas before returning to the cabin around 3:30 a.m. When he found Sasha still hadn't returned, he said he had finally woken Jennifer in a panic, and that's when they had both gone looking together until 4:01 a.m. It was a slightly more sophisticated lie than the first, accounting for the security footage of Thomas leaving alone, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Belmont let the silence stretch for a long moment after Thomas finished, watching the suspect's discomfort grow before asking his next question. "Thomas, if you were searching for Sasha during that time from 2:47 to 3:30, why do we not see you on any of the cameras in the disco area, the buffet, the casino, or any of the other locations you mentioned?" Belmont asked, his voice still calm but now carrying a prosecutorial weight. "And more importantly, why does the footage show you leaving via the aft stairwell, which leads down to the crew areas and service corridors, rather than the forward elevators that would take you to all those public spaces?" The color drained from Thomas's face as he realized the security net was tighter than he had anticipated. He stammered that he must have gotten turned around on the ship, that all the corridors looked the same in the middle of the night, that he was panicked and not thinking clearly, but Belmont wasn't buying it, and he pressed forward with another clip, this one showing Thomas returning to cabin 7042 at 3:24 a.m., not 3:30 as he had claimed, walking with that distinctive self-comforting gesture of gripping his own wrist. "Thomas, I need you to look very carefully at this footage," Belmont said, zooming in on Thomas's left wrist. "Do you see that watch you're wearing? Can you describe that watch for me?" Thomas glanced at the screen and then down at his own wrist, where the gold Rolex still sat, and he nodded slowly. "It was my father's," he said quietly, his voice losing some of its defensive edge. "He gave it to me before he died 2 years ago. It's a 1995 Rolex Datejust, and I never take it off." Belmont leaned back in his chair, letting that statement hang in the air, before delivering the blow that would crack Thomas's composure wide open. "Then can you explain to me why the crystal face of that watch is now shattered, and why we found fragments of watch crystal embedded in your stepdaughter's skull wounds?" Belmont asked, his voice hard now, all pretense of sympathy gone. Thomas's face went from pale to gray, and for several seconds he said nothing, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as his brain tried to formulate a response that could possibly explain away such damning physical evidence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, and his third alibi was so transparently desperate that even he seemed to know it wouldn't hold up. He claimed that earlier in the evening, around 8 p.m. before dinner, he had been up on Deck 10 near the railing, looking at the sunset, when he had accidentally banged his watch against the metal railing hard enough to crack the crystal. He hadn't noticed the damage at the time, Thomas said, because it was a small crack, but it must have shattered completely later, and pieces of the crystal must have fallen out throughout the evening. As for how those fragments ended up in Sasha's wounds, Thomas suggested that perhaps they had been on the deck somewhere, and Sasha had fallen or been pushed by someone else, landing on the fragments. It was a story so riddled with logical impossibilities that Belmont didn't even bother to hide his skepticism. "Thomas, our forensic team examined that watch, and the crystal didn't just crack, it shattered from a high-impact blow against a soft surface, not a metal railing," Belmont said, pulling out a forensic photograph of the watch. "The pattern of fracture is consistent with striking human bone at high velocity, and the fragments we recovered from Sasha's skull wounds were embedded deep, driven in by force, not from her falling on them." At 1:15 p.m., roughly 2 hours into the interrogation, Belmont decided it was time to remove any remaining doubt that Thomas was the primary suspect. He excused himself from the room, telling Thomas he needed to make some calls, and he left the suspect alone for 17 minutes, a tactical pause designed to let anxiety build. The security office was equipped with hidden cameras that recorded Thomas during this break, and the footage showed a man in psychological freefall. Thomas paced the small room, ran his hands through his hair repeatedly, and at one point stood with his face pressed against the wall, his shoulders shaking. When Belmont returned, he brought with him Agent Patricia Reeves and a forensic technician named David Kumar, and they carried several evidence bags. Belmont laid the bags on the table one by one, each containing a piece of the puzzle that was tightening around Thomas. The first bag contained the deck chair leg that had been recovered from a service closet on Deck 4, just 50 feet from where Sasha's body was found. The white-painted aluminum leg was stained with blood that preliminary testing had matched to Sasha's type, AB negative, a relatively rare blood type that only 1% of the population shares. The second bag contained fingernail clippings that the forensic team had collected from Sasha's body, and caught under 2 of those nails were skin cells that DNA testing would later prove belonged to Thomas Henn. "Your stepdaughter fought back." "Thomas," Belmont said, his voice low and intense. "She scratched you, and she left us evidence that you were there when she died." Thomas stared at the evidence bags as though they were poisonous snakes, and when he looked back up at Belmont, there were tears in his eyes, though whether they were tears of genuine remorse or simply fear of being caught, no one in that room could say. His fourth alibi emerged in fragments, a story he built as he spoke, testing each piece to see if it would hold weight. He admitted now that he had gone to see Sasha the previous night, but he claimed it was because she had texted him asking to talk. According to this new version, Sasha had been upset about something, though Thomas claimed he didn't know what, and she had wanted to meet him somewhere private, away from her mother. He said he had gone to Deck 4 because it was quiet and they could talk without interruption, and that Sasha had been there waiting for him near the service corridor entrance. But when he arrived, Thomas now claimed Sasha had been acting strange, possibly drunk, and she had started accusing him of not being a real father and of using her mother. Thomas said the conversation had escalated into an argument, and that Sasha had suddenly lunged at him, scratching his face and trying to push him. In his attempt to defend himself, Thomas claimed, he had grabbed her arms to restrain her, and she had slipped and fallen, hitting her head on the metal floor. He swore he had panicked, checked her pulse and found nothing, and in his terror he had tried to hide her body in the crew corridor before fleeing back to his cabin. It was a tale of tragic accident and panic, a story designed to evoke sympathy and reduce culpability, but it had one fatal flaw. Belmont pulled out another photograph, this one showing the blood spatter pattern at the actual crime scene, and he placed it directly in front of Thomas. "This is from our forensic analysis," Belmont said. "The blood spatter shows at least 6 separate impact points, Thomas. Your stepdaughter was struck multiple times with that deck chair leg while she was standing, then again while she was on the ground. This wasn't an accident. This was murder." By 3:30 p.m., the interrogation had been going for more than 4 hours, and Thomas Henn's psychological defenses were beginning to crumble in earnest. Belmont had ordered sandwiches and coffee brought in, maintaining the appearance that this was still a cooperative interview rather than a criminal interrogation, but both men knew the truth. Thomas picked at his turkey sandwich without eating it, his hands trembling visibly, while Belmont ate methodically, projecting calm control in contrast to the suspect's escalating panic. The security office had grown stuffy despite the air conditioning, and the smell of Thomas's fierce sweat was noticeable in the confined space, a pheromone of guilt that Belmont had learned to recognize over his years of breaking suspects. Outside the office, the Caribbean Princess remained anchored, and Belmont's team of 12 FBI agents and forensic specialists continued processing the scene interviewing witnesses, and building the case that would send Thomas Henn to federal prison for the rest of his life. Belmont decided it was time to deploy what he knew would be the most devastating piece of evidence, the one element that would make any story of accident or self-defense impossible to sustain. He pulled up a new video file on the laptop and he turned the screen so Thomas could see it clearly. "Thomas, I want to show you something that our tech team recovered from the ship's security system," Belmont said. "This is from a camera positioned in the Deck 7 corridor outside Sasha's cabin. The timestamp is 3:17 a.m., which is 7 minutes before you return to your own cabin." The video began to play, showing the empty hallway in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the overnight hours. At exactly 3:17:09 a.m., a door opened. Cabin 7054, which the passenger manifest showed was registered to Sasha Mitchell as a separate cabin from her parents, a common arrangement for teenage children traveling with families. Thomas Henn emerged from the cabin, and the camera captured him in profile for nearly 8 seconds as he looked both ways down the corridor before moving toward the camera and then out of frame. In those 8 seconds, every detail of Thomas's appearance was visible. He was wearing the same clothes he had worn to dinner, dark slacks, and a pale blue dress shirt, but the shirt was untucked, and there were dark stains visible on the right sleeve and chest. His hair was disheveled, plastered to his forehead with sweat. And most critically, on his left wrist, clearly visible even in the security camera's grainy footage, was the gold Rolex watch, its face catching the light and reflecting a bright spot directly into the camera lens. "You were in Sasha's cabin at 3:17 a.m., Thomas," Belmont said, freezing the frame on Thomas's face. "This was after you killed her. This was after you hid her body in the crew corridor. This was you fleeing the scene." Thomas stared at the frozen image of himself on the screen, and something inside him seemed to break. His shoulders sagged, his head dropped forward, and he began to cry, not the calculated tears of a man trying to manipulate his interrogator, but deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. For several minutes, Belmont let him cry, understanding that this emotional release often preceded confession, that suspects who had been holding onto lies for hours sometimes needed to purge themselves of the weight before they could speak truth. When Thomas finally looked up, his face was red and swollen, snot running from his nose, and he asked in a broken voice for a tissue. Belmont handed him a box of Kleenex from the desk, and he waited. "I need to tell you something," Thomas finally said, his voice hoarse. "But I need to explain why it happened, because if I just tell you what I did, you'll think I'm a monster, and I'm not. I'm not a monster." Belmont leaned forward, careful not to show the surge of adrenaline he felt at the prospect of a confession. "Thomas, I'm listening. Tell me what happened, and tell me why." Thomas's fifth alibi, if it could even be called that, was the first time he admitted to being present when Sasha died, though he still tried to frame himself as a victim of circumstances. According to this version, Sasha had texted him around 2:30 a.m. and asked him to come to her cabin, and when he arrived, she had confronted him with printouts of bank statements showing the transfers he had made from Jennifer's real estate trust fund. Thomas claimed that Sasha had threatened to show the documents to her mother in the morning, that she had called him a thief and a fraud, and that she had said she was going to make sure Jennifer divorced him and had him arrested. The argument had escalated, Thomas said, and Sasha had started screaming, and he had panicked because he knew if other passengers heard the commotion, they would come to investigate. He claimed he had put his hand over Sasha's mouth to quiet her, and that she had bitten him hard enough to draw blood, and that in his shock and pain he had pushed her away from him. Sasha had stumbled backward, Thomas said, and had hit her head on the corner of a desk in the cabin. He swore she had been unconscious, but still breathing, and that in his panic he had grabbed the deck chair from the balcony, intending to use it to stage an accident by placing it near her body. But when he tried to move Sasha, Thomas claimed, she had woken up and started screaming again, and in his desperation to silence her, He had struck her with the chair leg once, maybe twice, he wasn't sure. It was an admission of manslaughter at best, a story designed to minimize premeditation, but Belmont knew from the forensic evidence that it was still a lie. "Thomas, we've been talking for hours now, and I appreciate that you're trying to be honest with me," Belmont said, his tone measured. "But the physical evidence doesn't support what you're telling me. The blood spatter analysis shows that Sasha was struck at least 6 times, probably more. The angle of the blows indicates she was on the ground, probably already unconscious, when most of them were delivered. And the forensic pathologist's preliminary report indicates that the first blow was severe enough to fracture her skull, but she didn't die immediately. She was alive, Thomas, while you beat her." Thomas's face contorted with anguish, and he shook his head violently. No, it wasn't like that. I didn't mean to keep hitting her. I couldn't stop. She was going to ruin everything. She was going to destroy my life." The words came out in a rush, and then Thomas froze, realizing what he had just admitted. Belmont saw the moment of recognition in Thomas's eyes, the understanding that he had just confessed to murder, driven by self-interest, rather than panic or accident. "Tell me about the money." "Thomas," Belmont said, pivoting to the financial motive, "tell me about the $400,000 you took from Jennifer's trust fund." The floodgates opened, and Thomas talked for the next 37 minutes, a confession that was recorded on 3 separate devices and would be transcribed into a 41-page statement that prosecutors would enter into evidence at trial. Thomas explained that he had met Jennifer Mitchell 3 years ago, when she was still grieving the death of Sasha's father, who had died of cancer when Sasha was 13. Jennifer was a successful commercial real estate broker in Miami, and she had substantial assets, including a $1.2 million trust fund that her own parents had established for her before their deaths. When Thomas married Jennifer 18 months ago, he had been working as a financial advisor for a boutique wealth management firm, but he had been terminated 6 months into the marriage after a client complaint about unauthorized trades. Desperate to maintain the lifestyle Jennifer expected and to hide his unemployment from her, Thomas had forged her signature on documents that gave him access to her trust fund. Over the course of a year, he had siphoned off $400,000 in increments of $15,000 to $25,000, depositing the money into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands that he had set up under a shell corporation. His plan had been to replace the money once he got back on his feet professionally, but that had never happened, and the quarterly trust statement that was scheduled to arrive on February 20, 2023, just 6 days after the cruise, would have revealed the missing funds. Thomas had been living in a state of desperate dread, knowing that exposure was imminent, knowing that Jennifer would not only divorce him, but would likely press charges for fraud and embezzlement. The cruise was supposed to be a Valentine's gift, a chance to create good memories before the inevitable collapse. But Sasha had somehow gotten access to Jennifer's financial files and had discovered the theft. "She came to me 2 days before we left for the cruise," Thomas said, his voice flat now, drained of emotion. "She showed me the bank statements and she said she knew what I had done. She said she had copied everything to her laptop and to a thumb drive, and that if I didn't confess to her mother, she would do it herself. I begged her not to. I told her I would pay back every dollar, that I just needed time. But she didn't care. She said I had betrayed her mother's trust, that I was no better than a common criminal, and that her mom deserved to know the truth." Thomas paused, and when he continued, his voice was bitter. "I thought maybe on the cruise I could convince her to give me time. Maybe I could make her see that destroying me would hurt her mother too. But on Valentine's night, after dinner, she texted me and told me to come to her cabin at 3:00 a.m. She said she had made up her mind and that she was going to tell her mother in the morning as soon as we docked in Cozumel." Belmont listened without interrupting, and Thomas went on. "So I went to her cabin, and I tried one last time to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She called me a parasite, said I had married her mother for money, said I was disgusting, and something in me just snapped. Thomas looked down at his hands, at the Rolex watch that had betrayed him. I grabbed the chair from the balcony and I hit her, and then I hit her again, and I kept hitting her until she stopped moving. I don't even remember most of it. It's like I was watching someone else do it. Belmont pressed for details, and Thomas provided them with a clinical detachment that suggested he had already psychologically distanced himself from his actions. After killing Sasha, he had waited in her cabin for nearly 10 minutes, listening at the door to make sure no one had heard the struggle. When he was certain the corridor was empty, he had dragged Sasha's body the 200 feet to the crew service corridor, using the deck chair leg to prop open doors. Since his hands were occupied with the body, he had shoved her into the narrow space behind a maintenance cart, hoping she wouldn't be discovered for days, long enough for the ship to dock and for him to potentially flee. He had then thrown the deck chair leg into a service closet, washed his hands in a crew bathroom, and returned to his cabin, where Jennifer was still asleep, completely unaware that her husband had just murdered her daughter. Thomas had taken a 30-minute shower, changed his clothes, and put the blood-stained garments in a plastic laundry bag that he had hidden in his suitcase, planning to dispose of them once the ship docked. It was only when he climbed into bed and his hand brushed against his watch that he realized the crystal was shattered, and he had felt a surge of panic, but by then it was too late to go back and check if he had left any fragments at the scene. "I thought I could get away with it," Thomas said, looking up at Belmont with empty eyes. "I thought if I acted concerned enough, if I helped search for her, no one would suspect me. But I guess I was wrong." By 6 Scout p.m., Thomas had given his 6th alibi, which was actually just an expansion of his 5th, adding more details about the financial motive and the premeditation that had gone into planning the murder. He admitted that during the previous week before the cruise, he had researched cruise ship murders and had found that many went unsolved because of jurisdictional complications and the difficulty of securing crime scenes on moving vessels. He had even searched for unsolved murders at sea and cruise ship overboard accidents settlement, queries that FBI digital forensics experts had already recovered from his laptop's search history. When Belmont confronted him with printouts of these searches, Thomas didn't deny them. "I knew I might have to do something," he admitted. "I just didn't know what until she pushed me too far." It was a stunning admission of premeditation, the kind of statement that would seal Thomas's fate at trial, transforming the case from second-degree murder to first-degree capital murder under federal maritime law. Belmont kept pushing, knowing that he had Thomas on the ropes, knowing that the more details he could extract now, the stronger the case would be. "Thomas, you said Sasha had copied the financial documents to her laptop and a thumb drive. Where are those devices now?" Thomas's 7th and final alibi change came with this question, as he admitted what he had done with the evidence of his embezzlement. After killing Sasha, he had taken her laptop and the thumb drive from her cabin, and he had thrown them overboard from Deck 10, watching them disappear into the dark Caribbean waters. He had hoped that without those documents and without Sasha to testify, he could deny the embezzlement allegations or claim that any missing money was due to administrative errors. But what Thomas didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Sasha had been even smarter than he realized. Before meeting with Thomas that fatal night, Sasha had sent a text message to her best friend back in Miami, a girl named Rebecca Chen, and that text message would become the prosecution's most powerful piece of evidence. The message, time-stamped at 2:51 a.m. on February 14, 2023, read, "Meeting with Tom now to confront him about the money he stole from Mom. If anything happens to me, check his laptop. I've been sending myself copies of everything." Rebecca had been asleep when the message arrived, and she hadn't seen it until later that morning, but she had immediately contacted her own parents, who had then contacted Jennifer Mitchell, who had then contacted the FBI. By the time Thomas was sitting in the interrogation room confessing to murder, FBI agents were already executing a search warrant on the home he shared with Jennifer in Coral Gables, and they were seizing his personal laptop, which would prove to contain not only the incriminating search history, but also detailed spreadsheets tracking the embezzled funds and communications with the offshore bank holding his illicit accounts. At 7:53 p.m., after 8 hours and 33 minutes of interrogation, Thomas Henn was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder under Title 18, United States Code, Section 1111, as well as wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. Belmont read him his Miranda rights for the second time that day, the first having been at the beginning of the interrogation as a formality, and Thomas waived his right to remain silent and signed a written confession that summarized the admissions he had made throughout the day. He was handcuffed and escorted to a makeshift holding cell that had been set up in one of the ship's storage rooms, where he would remain under 24-hour guard until the Caribbean Princess returned to Miami the following day. Jennifer Mitchell, who had been kept in a separate cabin under FBI supervision while the interrogation proceeded, was informed of her husband's confession by Agent Reeves, and her reaction was captured on a body camera that would later be played at trial. "He killed my baby," Jennifer screamed, her voice hoarse with grief and rage. "He killed my baby for money. I want to see him. I want to look him in the eye and ask him why." But the FBI agents refused, explaining that allowing the victim's mother to confront the accused killer could jeopardize the case, and Jennifer collapsed in tears, her world shattered by the dual betrayal of losing her daughter and discovering that the man she loved was a murderer. The Caribbean Princess arrived at the port of Miami at 11:47 a.m. on February 15, 2023, escorted by 2 Coast Guard cutters, and met at the dock by a convoy of FBI vehicles, Miami-Dade police units, and coroner's vans. The ship's 200 passengers had been confined to their cabins overnight, informed only that there had been a serious incident requiring a criminal investigation, and the mood on board was a mixture of fear, anger, and morbid curiosity. Thomas Henn was the first person removed from the vessel, brought down the crew gangway in handcuffs and leg shackles, his head bowed as news helicopters circled overhead and cameras captured every second of his perp walk. He was transported directly to the Federal Detention Center in downtown Miami, where he would remain without bail for the next 11 months, awaiting trial. Sasha Mitchell's body was removed with far more dignity and care, placed in a flag-draped casket at Jennifer's request, even though Sasha had no military connection, simply because her mother wanted her daughter honored in death. The autopsy would be performed later that day by Dr. Michael Vasquez, the chief medical examiner for Miami-Dade County, and his findings would provide the scientific foundation for the prosecution's case. Dr. Vasquez's autopsy report was 67 pages long, accompanied by 143 photographs and detailed diagrams of Sasha's injuries. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in massive subdural hematoma, brain swelling, and ultimately fatal brain herniation. Sasha had sustained 8 separate impacts to her skull, 5 to the back of her head, and 3 to the right side, all delivered with sufficient force to fracture the skull at multiple points. The weapon was consistent with the recovered deck chair leg, an aluminum rod approximately 2 inches in diameter with a hollow core, which would have been light enough to swing repeatedly, but rigid enough to deliver devastating force. The pattern of injuries told a horrific story. Sasha had been standing when the first blow struck her from behind, driving her forward and down. The next 3 blows had been delivered while she was on her hands and knees, trying to crawl away, and the final 4 blows had been delivered while she was face down on the floor, probably already unconscious. Dr. Vasquez estimated that the attack lasted between 60 and 90 seconds, and that Sasha had remained alive for approximately 90 to 120 seconds after the final blow, her brainstem continuing to function even as massive bleeding filled her skull cavity. It was, the medical examiner noted in his report, an extremely violent and sustained attack, indicating rage or panic far beyond what would be necessary to simply incapacitate or silence the victim. The forensic analysis of Thomas's Rolex watch provided another layer of damning evidence. The watch was a 1995 Rolex Datejust with a sapphire crystal face, a material known for being extremely hard and scratch-resistant, requiring tremendous force to shatter. The fracture pattern indicated that the watch had struck a curved, semi-rigid surface with significant impact, and the distribution of missing crystal fragments suggested that the shattering occurred during the first or second blow to Sasha's head. FBI forensic specialists were able to recover 14 fragments of watch crystal from Sasha's scalp wounds and hair, and they matched these fragments to the watch using spectrographic analysis that compared the chemical composition and internal structure of the crystal. The largest fragment, measuring 4 millimeters across, was embedded 2 millimeters deep in Sasha's skull, driven in by the force of Thomas's blow. The watch itself showed blood residue in the crevices of the Jubilee bracelet and around the watch crown, and DNA analysis confirmed the blood was Sasha's. Even more incriminating, the inside of the watch band, which rested against Thomas's wrist, showed transfer blood stains, proving that Thomas had continued wearing the watch for some time after the murder, allowing Sasha's blood to seep under the band and stain his skin. The blood spatter analysis of both crime scenes, Sasha's cabin, and the crew corridor where her body was found, was conducted by FBI forensic expert Dr. Linda Kwan, who had 22 years of experience in bloodstain pattern analysis and had testified in more than 200 criminal trials. Dr. Kwan's report described the cabin as a scene of extreme violence, with high-velocity blood spatter on the walls up to 7 feet high, indicating the arterial spray that occurs when a skull fracture severs blood vessels near the surface of the brain. The spatter pattern was concentrated in an area near the cabin's desk, consistent with Thomas's admission that the attack began when he struck Sasha from behind. But there were also transfer patterns, bloody smears where the murder weapon had been dragged across the floor, and drip patterns leading from the cabin to the corridor that showed Thomas had moved the body in stages, stopping multiple times to rest or to check if anyone was coming. Most damning was a bloody handprint on the doorframe of Sasha's cabin, left when Thomas braced himself while dragging the body through the door. And that handprint was a perfect match to Thomas's right hand, down to the distinctive scar on his palm from a childhood injury. The digital forensic examination of Thomas's laptop, conducted by FBI computer scientist Marcus Williams, revealed a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. The laptop's search history showed that Thomas had begun researching cruise ship murders as early as February 3, 2023, 11 days before the cruise departed. His searches included: do cruise ships have security cameras? Maritime law murder jurisdiction? Can you get away with murder on a cruise ship? And most chillingly, how long does a body take to decompose in warm water? Thomas had also visited online forums where people discussed unsolved cruise ship disappearances, and he had bookmarked several articles about passengers who had gone overboard under suspicious circumstances. His browser history showed he had researched the specific layout of the Caribbean Princess, downloading deck plans and studying the locations of security cameras. Even more damning, Thomas's email account contained correspondence with the Cayman Islands Bank that held his illegal offshore account, including a message sent on February 10, 2023, in which Thomas had written, "I need to know if there is any way to move these funds quickly in an emergency. I may need to access everything and disappear on short notice. The bank's reply had informed him that moving more than $50,000 at once would trigger international reporting requirements, a limitation that had likely contributed to Thomas's decision that murdering Sasha was a better option than fleeing. The forensic examination of Thomas's clothing, the blood-stained shirt and pants he had hidden in his suitcase, provided additional confirmation of his guilt. The blood on the shirt was matched to Sasha through DNA analysis, and the spatter pattern indicated that Thomas had been standing directly over Sasha during at least some of the blows, close enough for her blood to spray upward onto his chest and face. Fabric fibers recovered from under Sasha's fingernails were matched to Thomas's shirt, confirming his admission that she had scratched him during their struggle. Most intriguingly, forensic botanist Dr. Elena Rodriguez found traces of mahogany wood dust on Thomas's pants, and this dust was matched to the mahogany deck railings that lined the ship's Deck 10 observation area. This evidence suggested that Thomas had gone to Deck 10 after the murder, possibly to dispose of evidence or to compose himself, a detail that aligned with witness statements from new passengers who reported seeing a man matching Thomas's description standing alone at the railing around 4:01 a.m., looking out at the ocean. One of these witnesses, a retired school teacher named Doris Hannigan, would testify at trial that the man had been crying, his shoulders shaking with sobs, and that she had almost approached him to ask if he was all right, but had decided against it because he seemed to want to be alone. The FBI's financial investigation, conducted by a team of forensic accountants led by Special Agent Rebecca Stanton, documented the embezzlement scheme in exhaustive detail. Thomas had gained access to Jennifer's trust fund by forging her signature on a power of attorney document, which he had then presented to the trust administrator at Wells Fargo Bank. Over a 13-month period, Thomas had made 27 separate transfers from the trust account to his offshore Cayman account, each transfer carefully calculated to be below the $25,000 threshold that would have triggered automatic review by the bank's fraud detection systems. He had covered his tracks by creating fake account statements that he would show Jennifer when she periodically asked about the trust's performance, statements that showed the account balance remaining stable, when in reality it had been depleted by nearly a third. The forged statements were expertly done, using Wells Fargo's actual letterhead and logo, which Thomas had obtained by scanning a legitimate statement and then altering the figures using photo editing software. The scheme had been remarkably sophisticated and might have continued undetected for years if not for Sasha's decision to review her mother's financial files, a decision motivated by her growing suspicion that Thomas was not the successful financial advisor he claimed to be. Sasha's text message to her friend Rebecca Chen, the message sent at 2:51 a.m. just minutes before her murder, became the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The message had been recovered from Rebecca's phone by FBI digital forensics, and it was entered into evidence along with a detailed analysis showing that it had been sent from Sasha's phone using the ship's satellite internet connection, making it virtually impossible to dispute its authenticity. The message's content, warning Rebecca to check his laptop if anything happened, demonstrated that Sasha had not only known about Thomas's crimes, but had feared for her safety, suggesting that she had recognized the danger she was in by confronting him. Even more poignant were the 37 emails that Sasha had sent to herself over the previous week, emails with attachments containing scanned copies of Jennifer's bank statements, the forged power of attorney document, and other evidence of Thomas's fraud. These emails, recovered from Sasha's Gmail account, proved that she had been methodically building a case against Thomas, and that her confrontation with him on the cruise had not been impulsive, but rather the culmination of careful investigation. The emails showed a level of maturity and courage that made Sasha's murder even more tragic. A young woman trying to protect her mother from a predator, only to be killed by that same predator when he felt cornered. The interrogation footage from the ship's security office, all 8 hours and 33 minutes of it, was carefully reviewed by FBI supervisors and prosecutors to ensure that Thomas's confession had been obtained legally and could be used at trial. The review concluded that Special Agent Belmont had conducted the interrogation by the book, that Thomas had been properly Mirandized, that he had voluntarily waived his rights, and that no coercion or promises had been made. The footage showed Belmont to be a master interrogator, patient and methodical, allowing Thomas to spin his web of lies and then systematically dismantling each alibi with evidence. The video also captured the moment of Thomas's psychological collapse, the point at which he stopped trying to maintain his innocence and began to rationalize his actions, a transition that jurors would later describe as chilling and proof of his guilt. The prosecution would play excerpts of this footage at trial, carefully selecting moments that showed Thomas's callousness and lack of genuine remorse, including a 4-minute segment in which Thomas complained that the ship's security office chair was uncomfortable and asked if he could return to his cabin to get a pillow. The reconstruction of the timeline of Sasha's final hours, assembled by the FBI's investigative team using security footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence, painted a picture of a young woman who had spent Valentine's Day vacillating between enjoying the cruise and dreading the confrontation she knew was coming. Sasha had attended the ship's teen disco from 10:15 p.m. until 1:30 a.m., dancing with a group of teens she had befriended on the cruise, and multiple witnesses described her as seeming happy and normal, showing no signs of fear or distress. But at 1:32 a.m., security footage showed Sasha returning to her cabin alone, and at 2:15 a.m., footage from a camera near the ship's internet cafe showed her sitting at a computer terminal, presumably sending the emails to herself that would preserve evidence of Thomas's crimes. At 2:43 a.m., Sasha returned to her cabin, and at 2:51 a.m., she sent the text message to Rebecca. The cabin's door opened again at 2:58 a.m., admitting Thomas, and it would not open again until 3:17 a.m., when Thomas emerged alone. Those 19 minutes represented the entirety of Sasha's murder, from the moment Thomas entered her cabin to the moment he left her body hidden in the crew corridor. The psychological profile of Thomas Henn, prepared by FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Samantha Torres, characterized him as a narcissistic personality with sociopathic traits, an individual who viewed other people primarily as tools to advance his own interests. Dr. Torres noted that Thomas's choice to marry Jennifer Mitchell, a wealthy widow still grieving her first husband, showed a predatory calculation, and that his willingness to kill Sasha when she threatened his financial security demonstrated a complete lack of empathy or moral constraint. The profile suggested that Thomas likely viewed himself as the victim in this scenario, someone who had been forced to kill Sasha by her unreasonable refusal to give him more time to replace the stolen money. This self-centered worldview was evident in Thomas's confession, Dr. Torres noted, particularly in statements like, "She was going to ruin everything, and she pushed me too far," language that blamed the victim for her own murder. The profile concluded that Thomas posed an ongoing danger to society and should be held without bail pending trial, a recommendation that the federal magistrate accepted at Thomas's initial appearance on February 16, 2023. Jennifer Mitchell's victim impact statement, prepared in the weeks following Sasha's murder, was a 9-page document that would be read in its entirety at Thomas's sentencing. In the statement, Jennifer described Sasha as a brilliant and compassionate young woman who had dreamed of becoming an environmental lawyer and who had volunteered every weekend at a sea turtle rehabilitation center in the Florida Keys. Sasha had been accepted early decision to Duke University, Jennifer wrote, and had been planning to major in environmental policy with a focus on marine conservation. She had loved photography, particularly underwater photography, and had spent the previous summer taking a scuba certification course so she could photograph coral reefs. Jennifer described the pain of losing Sasha as a wound that will never heal, and she wrote about the additional betrayal of discovering that her husband, the man she had trusted to be a father figure to her daughter, had been the one who took Sasha's life. "Thomas didn't just kill my daughter," Jennifer wrote. "He murdered the man I thought I married. He murdered my ability to trust. He murdered my sense of safety in the world. Every good memory I have of our time together is now poisoned by the knowledge of what he was planning, what he was capable of. I will spend the rest of my life wondering if he ever loved me at all, or if I was just a mark, a source of money to be exploited." The recovery of the deck chair leg from the service closet on Deck 4, conducted by FBI Evidence Response Team technicians on the morning of February 15th, 2023, provided the murder weapon that would be central to the prosecution's case. The chair leg, measuring 29 inches long and weighing 1.2 pounds, was made of anodized aluminum with rubber end caps, and it showed signs of heavy impact on one end, with the rubber cap partially torn away and the metal underneath deformed. The blood on the leg was so substantial that it had dripped onto the floor of the closet, leaving a small pool that had partially dried by the time investigators found it. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood was Sasha's, and forensic tool mark analysis showed that the pattern of deformation on the chair leg matched the dimensions of Sasha's skull fractures, providing definitive proof that this was the weapon used to kill her. The chair leg was photographed extensively, and those photographs would be displayed on large screens for the jury during trial, forcing them to confront the brutal reality of what Thomas had done. The interrogation of Thomas Henn also revealed details about his movements after the murder that demonstrated consciousness of guilt and an attempt to establish an alibi. After hiding Sasha's body and returning to his cabin at 3:24 a.m., Thomas had taken a long shower, spending more than 30 minutes in the bathroom scrubbing his skin and hair, trying to remove any trace of blood or forensic evidence. He had placed his blood-stained clothes in a plastic bag and hidden them at the bottom of his suitcase, beneath layers of other clothing, and he had cleaned his Rolex watch with soap and a toothbrush, though he had not noticed that the shattered crystal left the watch face exposed and vulnerable. Thomas had then set an alarm on his phone for 7 a.m., planning to wake up and begin the performance of a concerned stepfather searching for his missing stepdaughter, a performance that would establish his apparent innocence in the eyes of other passengers and crew. He had even rehearsed what he would say, practicing expressions of worry and confusion, though when the actual moment came, his performance had been less convincing than he had hoped. Multiple crew members who interacted with Thomas that morning later told FBI agents that he had seemed off, that his concern felt acted, and that his eyes had appeared cold, even when his voice expressed worry. The arrest of Thomas Henn at the Port of Miami was conducted with maximum security, as federal prosecutors were concerned about the possibility that Thomas might have access to additional offshore funds and could attempt to flee. Thomas was transported in a heavily armored FBI vehicle, escorted by 4 additional vehicles, and the convoy took an indirect route to the federal detention center to avoid any potential ambush or escape attempt. At the detention center, Thomas was placed in administrative segregation, isolated from other inmates both for his own protection and to prevent him from potentially tampering with witnesses or coordinating an escape. He was allowed only limited contact with his court-appointed attorney, Hiram Greenberg, a federal public defender with 15 years of experience in maritime law, who would face the impossible task of defending a client whose guilt was supported by overwhelming evidence. Greenberg's first meeting with Thomas lasted 3 hours, and afterward he told colleagues that it was the most hopeless case he had ever taken on, a sentiment that would prove accurate when the trial began 11 months later. The FBI's forensic accounting investigation led by Special Agent Rebecca Stanton and her team of 5 certified fraud examiners, took 4 months to complete and resulted in a 412-page report that detailed every financial transaction Thomas Henn had made over the previous 3 years. The investigation revealed that Thomas's financial situation had been far more desperate than even his confession had suggested, and that his embezzlement of Jennifer's trust fund was just one part of a larger pattern of fraud and deception. Thomas had been fired from his job at the wealth management firm not just because of a single client complaint, as he had told Jennifer, but because of multiple allegations of churning, a practice where financial advisors make excessive trades in client accounts to generate commissions for themselves. 3 clients had filed formal complaints with FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and Thomas had been forced to resign rather than face a hearing that would have resulted in him losing his license permanently. Rather than admit this to Jennifer, Thomas had lied and told her he had left the firm to start his own consulting business, a business that never actually existed beyond a fake website and business cards. The investigation into the offshore Cayman Islands account revealed that Thomas had opened it 8 months before marrying Jennifer, suggesting that his marriage to her may have been premeditated and motivated by financial gain from the start. The account had been opened under the name Clearwater Holdings, LLC, a shell corporation that Thomas had registered in Delaware using a registered agent service, creating a layer of anonymity that would have made the account difficult to trace if investigators hadn't obtained Thomas's laptop with all the account access information saved in his browser. Over the 18 months of Thomas's marriage to Jennifer, he had deposited a total of $437,000 into the Clearwater account, $400,000 of which came from Jennifer's trust fund, and the remaining $37,000 from credit cards he had opened fraudulently in Jennifer's name without her knowledge. The credit card fraud was discovered when FBI agents executed search warrants on Thomas's online accounts and found statements for 7 different cards, all with balances near their $5,000 to $10,000 limits, all used primarily for cash advances that were then transferred to the offshore account. Jennifer had no idea these cards existed, and their discovery added 7 counts of identity theft to the charges Thomas would eventually face. The forensic accountants also uncovered evidence that Thomas had been planning to flee the country if his embezzlement was discovered. In the weeks before the cruise, Thomas had made inquiries with 3 different immigration consultants in Central American countries, asking about residency requirements and extradition treaties with the United States. He had specifically researched countries with no extradition treaty, focusing on Nicaragua, Honduras, and Belize, and he had gone so far as to contact a real estate agent in Belize about purchasing property. One email sent from Thomas's account on February 8, 2023, just 6 days before the cruise, read, "I am looking for a property that can be purchased quickly with minimal paperwork, preferably something remote where privacy is valued. Money is not an issue, but speed is essential. I may need to relocate on very short notice." The real estate agent had responded with several listings for beachfront properties on remote islands, and Thomas had bookmarked these listings on his laptop. This evidence of flight planning would be introduced at trial to demonstrate that Thomas knew his crimes would eventually be discovered and that he was prepared to abandon Jennifer and disappear rather than face justice. The analysis of the forged power of attorney document that Thomas had used to gain access to Jennifer's trust fund revealed a sophisticated level of fraud that suggested he had either done this before or had received help from someone with expertise in document forgery. The signature on the document was an expert forgery of Jennifer's signature, so accurate that even a handwriting analyst initially had difficulty confirming it was fake. The document had been notarized using a notary stamp that appeared legitimate, but further investigation revealed that the notary's commission number was fake, registered to a person who had died 5 years earlier. This suggested that Thomas had purchased the forged notary stamp from a professional document forger, and FBI investigators spent weeks trying to track down the source, ultimately identifying a dark web marketplace where fake notary stamps were sold for $500 each. The marketplace had been shut down by law enforcement 2 months before the murder, but archived records showed that a user with the handle Clearwater Consult had made a purchase matching Thomas's needs, and IP address analysis linked that user account to Thomas's home computer. Prosecutor Maria Gonzalez, who would lead the government's case against Thomas Henn, was a 16-year veteran of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, with a conviction rate of 94% in the 87 cases she had tried. She had a reputation as a fierce and thorough prosecutor who left nothing to chance, and she had requested the Henn case personally after reading the initial incident reports from the FBI. Gonzalez spent 6 months preparing for trial, working 14-hour days assembling evidence, interviewing witnesses, and constructing a narrative that would leave the jury with no doubt about Thomas's guilt. She brought in expert witnesses from around the country, including Dr. Linda Kwan for the blood spatter analysis, Dr. Michael Vasquez for the autopsy findings, and Dr. Samantha Torres for the psychological profile. She coordinated with the FBI's forensic lab to ensure that every piece of physical evidence was analyzed multiple times using different methods, eliminating any possibility of defense challenges based on unreliable science. And she worked closely with Jennifer Mitchell, preparing her to testify against her husband, a process that Gonzalez later described as one of the most emotionally difficult aspects of her career, watching a mother relive the loss of her child while coming to terms with the monster she had married. The defense team, led by federal public defender Hiram Greenberg and assisted by junior attorney Lisa Chen, faced an almost impossible task. Thomas's confession, captured on video and corroborated by overwhelming physical evidence, made any argument of innocence untenable. Greenberg's strategy focused instead on trying to mitigate the sentence, arguing for second-degree murder rather than first-degree, emphasizing Thomas's lack of criminal history and suggesting that the murder was the result of a psychological breakdown rather than cold-blooded premeditation. Greenberg hired his own psychological expert, Dr. Richard Hoffman, a forensic psychologist who examined Thomas for 8 hours over 3 days, and produced a report arguing that Thomas suffered from acute stress disorder and dissociative symptoms at the time of the murder. According to Dr. Hoffman's analysis, Thomas had been under such severe psychological pressure from the impending discovery of his embezzlement that he had entered a fugue state, a condition where individuals act without full conscious awareness of their actions. It was a creative defense strategy, but one that would ultimately fail to convince either the judge or the jury, particularly given the evidence of premeditation shown in Thomas's internet searches and his attempts to dispose of evidence after the murder. The grand jury indictment handed down on March 15, 2023, charged Thomas Henn with 13 separate federal crimes: first-degree murder under maritime jurisdiction, felony murder, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, wire fraud, identity theft, 7 counts, and making false statements to federal officers. Each count carried significant prison time, and if convicted on all counts, Thomas faced a potential sentence of life without parole, plus 165 years, ensuring that he would die in federal prison even if some convictions were overturned on appeal. The indictment was 47 pages long, detailing each crime with specific dates, locations, and evidence, and it represented the culmination of the FBI's 4-month investigation. The day the indictment was unsealed, Prosecutor Gonzalez held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse in Miami, with Jennifer Mitchell standing beside her, and she vowed to seek the maximum sentence allowed under law. Sasha Mitchell was a 17-year-old girl with her whole life ahead of her, Gonzalez said, her voice firm and clear. She was murdered by a man who was supposed to protect her, a man who valued money more than her life. This office will do everything in our power to ensure that Thomas Henn never sees freedom again. The federal trial of United States versus Thomas Henn began on January 8, 2024, in the ceremonial courtroom of the Wilkie D. Ferguson Jr. United States Courthouse in downtown Miami, before the Honorable Roberta Hernandez, a Reagan-appointed judge with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom and having little patience for theatrics. The jury selection process took 4 days, as both the prosecution and defense questioned more than 100 potential jurors about their ability to remain impartial in a case that had received extensive media coverage in South Florida. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 29 to 68, with backgrounds including a retired postal worker, a nurse, a construction supervisor, an insurance adjuster, and a high school science teacher. Judge Hernandez gave them stern instructions about avoiding media coverage and not discussing the case with anyone, and she sequestered them in a downtown hotel for the duration of the trial, which she estimated would last 3 weeks. The courtroom was packed with spectators on the first day, including 37 reporters from local and national media outlets, 14 of Sasha's classmates and teachers from Coral Gables Senior High School, and Jennifer Mitchell, who sat in the front row directly behind the prosecution table, her eyes fixed on Thomas with a mixture of grief and hatred. Prosecutor Maria Gonzalez's opening statement lasted 87 minutes and was a masterclass in narrative construction, beginning with a description of Sasha Mitchell as a vibrant young woman with dreams and aspirations, and then detailing the systematic betrayal by Thomas Henn that culminated in her brutal murder. Gonzalez walked the jury through the financial crimes first, explaining how Thomas had forged documents, stolen $400,000, and lived a lie for more than a year while pretending to be a loving stepfather and husband. She then described the moment when Sasha discovered the truth, showing the jury copies of the bank statements Sasha had found and the text message she had sent to Rebecca Chen, warning that if anything happened to her, it would be Thomas's fault. Gonzalez's voice remained calm and controlled as she described the murder itself, but when she reached the part about Sasha being alive for 2 minutes after the first blow, conscious and aware as Thomas continued to beat her, several jurors visibly recoiled, and 2 women in the jury box began to cry. Gonzalez concluded by telling the jury that they would see video of Thomas's confession, that they would hear from forensic experts who would explain the physical evidence, and that by the end of the trial, they would have no doubt that Thomas Henn was guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. Defense attorney Hiram Greenberg's opening statement was only 22 minutes long, a stark contrast to the prosecution's detailed narrative, and it focused almost entirely on the concept of reasonable doubt. Greenberg acknowledged that Thomas had killed Sasha, a fact that the video confession made undeniable, but he argued that the killing was not premeditated and should be considered second-degree murder or even voluntary manslaughter. He painted a picture of Thomas as a man who had made terrible financial decisions, who had panicked when confronted, and who had acted in a moment of fear and desperation rather than cold calculation. Greenberg told the jury that they would hear testimony from Dr. Richard Hoffman about Thomas's mental state, and that they would learn that Thomas had been suffering from severe psychological distress that impaired his judgment. "This is not a case about a monster," Greenberg said, looking directly at the jurors. "This is a case about a deeply flawed human being who made the worst decision of his life in a moment of crisis. He deserves to be punished, but he does not deserve to be treated as though he planned this murder in advance." It was a risky strategy, essentially conceding guilt while arguing for a lesser charge, but given the strength of the evidence, Greenberg had few other options. The prosecution's first witness was Jennifer Mitchell, and her testimony on the trial's second day was so emotionally powerful that Judge Hernandez had to call 2 recesses to allow Jennifer to compose herself and to give the jury time to recover. Jennifer described her relationship with Thomas, how they had met at a charity fundraiser 18 months after her first husband's death, how Thomas had seemed kind and attentive, how he had made an effort to bond with Sasha. She testified that she had never suspected Thomas of any wrongdoing, that she had trusted him completely with her finances, and that she had been shocked and devastated to learn about the embezzlement. When Gonzalez asked Jennifer to describe Sasha, Jennifer broke down completely, sobbing so hard that she could barely speak. "She was my whole world," Jennifer said through her tears. "She was smart and funny and so full of life. She wanted to save the ocean, to protect sea turtles and coral reefs. She had this dream of starting a nonprofit to clean up ocean plastic, and he took all of that away from her. He took away her future, her dreams, everything." Jennifer's testimony lasted 5 hours over 2 days, and by the time she stepped down from the witness stand, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom, including several of the jurors who would later say that her testimony had convinced them of Thomas's guilt more than any physical evidence could have. The prosecution's case proceeded methodically over the next 2 weeks, with Gonzalez calling 47 witnesses and introducing 238 pieces of evidence. Dr. Michael Vasquez, the medical examiner, testified for an entire day about the autopsy findings, using anatomical diagrams and photographs to explain the extent of Sasha's injuries. He described each of the 8 blows to her skull, explaining the trajectory and force of each impact. And he told the jury that Sasha had suffered immensely in her final moments, that she would have been aware of what was happening to her even as she lost consciousness. Dr. Linda Kwan, the blood spatter expert, testified for 6 hours about the forensic analysis of the crime scene, using laser pointers and 3D models to show the jury exactly how the murder had unfolded. She explained that the blood spatter patterns proved Sasha had been struck repeatedly while she was down, contradicting any suggestion that this was a single blow that accidentally caused her death. FBI forensic specialist Marcus Williams testified about the analysis of Thomas's laptop, displaying for the jury the search history that showed Thomas researching cruise ship murders and offshore bank accounts. The jury was shown screenshots of Thomas's searches, including how to get away with murder at sea and countries with no extradition to USA, searches that made his premeditation undeniable. Special Agent John Belmont's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, and Gonzalez had saved him for the trial's 3rd week to ensure maximum impact. Belmont spent 3 days on the stand, walking the jury through every detail of his investigation, from the initial discovery of Sasha's body to the 8-hour interrogation of Thomas on the ship. Belmont's testimony was calm and professional, delivered with the authority of a veteran investigator who had seen and solved countless murders. He described the moment when he realized Thomas was lying, the moment when he confronted Thomas with the security footage, and the moment when Thomas finally broke down and confessed. The courtroom was completely silent as Belmont recounted Thomas's admission of guilt, and several jurors leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word. When Gonzalez asked Belmont if he had any doubt about Thomas's guilt, Belmont looked directly at the jury and said, "No doubt whatsoever. Thomas Henn killed Sasha Mitchell to cover up his crimes, and he did so with full knowledge of what he was doing." On cross-examination, Greenberg tried to suggest that Belmont had coerced the confession, but Belmont calmly explained that Thomas had been Mirandized, had waived his rights, and had confessed voluntarily after being confronted with overwhelming evidence. The playing of the interrogation video on the trial's 17th day was the prosecution's knockout blow. Gonzalez had edited the 8 hours of footage down to 2 hours and 37 minutes, removing bathroom breaks, and other irrelevant segments, focusing on the moments when Thomas changed his story and when he finally admitted to the murder. The jury watched in rapt attention as Thomas's lies unraveled on screen, as his alibis shifted and changed, as his composure cracked, and he began to cry. When the video reached the moment of confession, when Thomas admitted, "I hit her, and then I hit her again, and I kept hitting her until she stopped moving," several jurors gasped audibly, and one male juror put his hand over his mouth as though fighting nausea. The video showed Thomas's complete lack of remorse, his concern only for himself and the consequences he would face, his attempt to blame Sasha for pushing him too far. After the video concluded, Judge Hernandez called a 30-minute recess, and multiple jurors were seen crying in the hallway outside the courtroom. When the trial resumed, Gonzalez rested the prosecution's case, and every person in the courtroom knew that the defense had no realistic chance of creating reasonable doubt. The defense case began on the trial's 18th day, and Hiram Greenberg called only 9 witnesses over 3 days, a stark contrast to the prosecution's 47 witnesses. Greenberg's strategy was narrow and focused, attempting to establish that Thomas had been under severe psychological stress and that his actions, while criminal, were not the result of premeditated planning, but rather a spontaneous breakdown. Dr. Richard Hoffman, the defense's psychological expert, testified for 7 hours about his examination of Thomas and his conclusion that Thomas had been suffering from acute stress disorder, generalized anxiety, and depressive symptoms in the weeks leading up to the cruise. Hoffman described Thomas's childhood, including an abusive father who had died when Thomas was 15, leaving him with unresolved trauma and attachment issues. He argued that Thomas's financial crimes were driven not by greed, but by a desperate fear of being abandoned by Jennifer, that Thomas had convinced himself he could replace the stolen money before being discovered, and that when Sasha confronted him, he had experienced a psychological break that led to the murder. It was a sympathetic narrative designed to humanize Thomas and make the jury see him as a damaged person rather than a monster. But on cross-examination, Prosecutor Gonzalez systematically destroyed Hoffman's conclusions. Gonzalez confronted Hoffman with the evidence of Thomas's internet searches, asking how a man in a spontaneous psychological break could have spent weeks researching how to commit and get away with murder. She pressed him on Thomas's attempts to dispose of evidence, asking how someone in a fugue state could have been lucid enough to hide Sasha's body, clean his watch, and create a false alibi. Hoffman struggled to answer these questions, eventually conceding that his diagnosis was based primarily on Thomas's self-reported symptoms during their interviews, and that he could not explain away the evidence of planning and cover-up. By the time Hoffman stepped down from the stand, his credibility was in tatters, and post-trial interviews with jurors revealed that his testimony had actually hurt the defense more than helped it, making Thomas appear manipulative rather than mentally ill. Greenberg's other witnesses, including 2 character witnesses who testified about Thomas being a good person before the murder and a financial expert who explained the pressures of debt, were similarly ineffective in the face of the prosecution's overwhelming evidence. Thomas Henn himself did not testify, a decision made by Greenberg despite Thomas's repeated insistence that he wanted to take the stand and explain everything. Greenberg recognized that putting Thomas on the stand would be suicidal, that Gonzalez would eviscerate him on cross-examination, that the jury would see his narcissism and lack of genuine remorse, and that any benefit from humanizing him would be vastly outweighed by the damage to the defense case. Greenberg explained this to Thomas in a 4-hour meeting in the jail's attorney conference room, and while Thomas eventually agreed not to testify, he did so reluctantly, convinced that if he could just talk to the jury, he could make them understand. This delusion that Thomas believed he could charm his way out of a first-degree murder conviction was itself evidence of the narcissistic personality traits that Dr. Torres had identified in her psychological profile. The decision not to testify was probably the only correct strategic choice Greenberg made during the trial, as post-trial jury interviews confirmed that jurors would have viewed Thomas's testimony as self-serving and manipulative. The defense rested its case on the trial's 21st day, and closing arguments began immediately afterward. Greenberg's closing argument lasted 52 minutes and was a final attempt to convince the jury that this was a crime of passion rather than premeditation. He argued that Thomas's internet searches were evidence of anxiety and paranoia rather than planning, that the murder weapon had been grabbed spontaneously rather than brought to the scene, and that Thomas's attempts to hide the evidence were the actions of a panicked man rather than a calculating killer. Greenberg acknowledged that Thomas had killed Sasha, that he had committed terrible crimes, but he asked the jury to consider second-degree murder or voluntary manslaughter verdicts that would reflect the spontaneous nature of the act. He reminded them that reasonable doubt did not mean no doubt, and that if they had any question about whether Thomas had planned the murder in advance, they were obligated to return a lesser verdict. It was a competent closing argument given the circumstances, but it faced the insurmountable obstacle of the evidence, and Greenberg knew, even as he spoke, that he was fighting a losing battle. Prosecutor Maria Gonzalez's closing argument was a devastating 97-minute summation that methodically reviewed every piece of evidence and dismantled every defense claim. She began by addressing the defense's mental health argument directly, pointing out that a man who could forge documents, create shell corporations, and embezzle $400,000 without getting caught for over a year was not suffering from impaired judgment or psychological breaks. She walked the jury through the timeline of Thomas's internet searches, showing that he had been researching cruise ship murders for 11 days before the cruise, proving premeditation beyond any doubt. She displayed the security footage of Thomas leaving Sasha's cabin with the gold Rolex visible on his wrist, the watch that had shattered while he beat a 17-year-old girl to death to cover up his crimes. Gonzalez reminded the jury of Sasha's final text message, warning her friend that if anything happened, it would be Thomas's fault, a prescient message that proved Sasha knew she was in danger and that Thomas was the threat. She described Jennifer Mitchell's testimony, the pain of a mother who had lost everything, and she reminded them that Thomas had shown no remorse, only self-pity and concern for his own fate. In the final 15 minutes of her closing argument, Gonzalez's voice rose with righteous anger as she called on the jury to hold Thomas accountable for his crimes. Sasha Mitchell was 17 years old, Gonzalez said, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. She had been accepted to Duke University. She wanted to save sea turtles and clean up the ocean. She confronted Thomas Henn because she was brave and because she loved her mother and wanted to protect her. And Thomas Henn beat her to death with a deck chair leg because he cared more about money than he cared about her life. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a spontaneous act. This was cold-blooded, premeditated murder, and the defendant deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. Gonzalez paused, looking directly at the jury, and then she pointed at Thomas Henn, who sat motionless at the defense table, his face expressionless. When you go back into that jury room, you will have a choice. You can send a message that in America, you cannot steal from the people who trust you, you cannot murder children to cover up your crimes, and you cannot expect to escape justice. Or you can let Thomas Henn escape with a lesser charge and a shorter sentence. I trust that you will make the right choice. As Gonzalez sat down, the courtroom erupted in applause, and Judge Hernandez had to bang her gavel repeatedly to restore order, warning spectators that she would clear the courtroom if there were any further outbursts. Judge Hernandez's jury instructions took 73 minutes to deliver, and she carefully explained the elements of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, and voluntary manslaughter, giving the jury the option to consider lesser charges if they believed the evidence supported them. She explained the concept of premeditation, telling the jury that it did not require days or weeks of planning, that it could be formed in a matter of minutes or even seconds, as long as the defendant had time to reflect on the consequences of his actions before committing the crime. She instructed them on the standard of reasonable doubt, emphasizing that it was not the same as possible doubt or imaginary doubt, but rather a doubt based on reason and common sense after careful consideration of all the evidence. At 4:47 p.m. on the trial's 22nd day, the jury retired to begin deliberations, and the wait began. Gonzalez and her team retired to the U.S. Attorney's Office conference room on the 9th floor of the courthouse, while Greenberg remained in a small attorney conference room on the 3rd floor with Thomas, who chain-smoked cigarettes and paced nervously, alternating between confident predictions of acquittal and paranoid fears that the jury would convict him of all charges. The jury deliberated for 11 hours and 34 minutes, spanning 2 days, before reaching a verdict. On the afternoon of the trial's 23rd day, at 3:21 p.m., the jury foreman sent a note to Judge Hernandez indicating that they had reached a unanimous decision on all counts. The judge ordered the parties to return to the courtroom, and within 30 minutes the spectator gallery was once again packed, with Jennifer Mitchell back in her seat in the front row, flanked by her sister and her parents, all of them holding hands and praying silently. Thomas Henn was brought from the holding cell, looking haggard and pale, having barely slept during the deliberations, and he took his seat at the defense table without making eye contact with anyone. Prosecutor Gonzalez sat ramrod straight, projecting confidence, though later she would admit that she had been nervous despite the strength of her case, knowing that juries could be unpredictable. Judge Hernandez entered the courtroom, and after everyone was seated, she instructed the bailiff to bring in the jury. The jury filed in slowly, none of them looking at Thomas, a sign that experienced trial lawyers know usually indicates a guilty verdict. Judge Hernandez asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreman, a 54-year-old construction supervisor named Michael Rodriguez, stood and said, "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The judge instructed Rodriguez to hand the verdict forms to the bailiff, who walked them to the bench, and Judge Hernandez spent several minutes reviewing them silently before handing them to the court clerk to be read aloud. The courtroom was utterly silent, so quiet that the sound of Jennifer Mitchell's quiet sobbing was clearly audible. The clerk stood and began to read. In the matter of United States versus Thomas Henn, case number 23 CR 200134, as to count 1 first-degree murder, we the jury find the defendant, Thomas Henn, guilty. A collective gasp went up from the spectators, and Jennifer Mitchell let out a sound that was half sob and half scream, her body shaking with the force of her emotions. The clerk continued reading, finding Thomas guilty on all 13 counts, including the 7 counts of identity theft, the wire fraud, the obstruction of justice, and the tampering with evidence. Each guilty verdict landed like a hammer blow, and by the time the clerk finished, Thomas Henn had slumped forward in his chair, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Judge Hernandez polled the jury individually, asking each of them to confirm that this was indeed their verdict, and all 12 jurors answered affirmatively, their voices firm and clear. The judge then thanked the jury for their service, telling them that they had performed a difficult civic duty with diligence and care, and she formally discharged them from the case. Several jurors were crying as they left the courtroom, visibly affected by the trauma of having seen the evidence and heard the testimony in such a brutal case. Gonzalez stood and requested an immediate sentencing date, and Judge Hernandez scheduled the sentencing hearing for February 26, 2024, giving both sides 4 weeks to prepare sentencing memoranda and to arrange for victim impact statements. Thomas was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, and as he passed by Jennifer Mitchell, He turned and tried to speak to her, saying, "Jennifer, I'm sorry, But Jennifer cut him off with a scream of rage. "Don't you say my name! Don't you ever say my name! You murdered my daughter! You're a monster!" Bailiffs quickly moved to separate them, and Thomas was dragged from the courtroom as Jennifer collapsed in tears in her sister's arms. The verdict made national news that evening, with coverage on every major network and cable news channel. Legal analysts praised Prosecutor Gonzalez's trial strategy and noted that the conviction on first-degree murder opened the door for a life sentence without possibility of parole. Defense attorneys commenting on the case acknowledged that Greenberg had faced an impossible situation and had done as well as could be expected given the evidence, but that the video confession and the forensic evidence had simply been too powerful to overcome. The online reaction was swift and overwhelming, with social media users expressing satisfaction with the verdict and calling for the maximum possible sentence. A Facebook page called Justice for Sasha Mitchell gained 140,000 followers in the first 24 hours after the verdict, and messages of support for Jennifer Mitchell poured in from around the world. Multiple true crime podcasts devoted special episodes to the case, analyzing the investigation and the trial, and several noted that this case would likely be studied in law schools as an example of effective prosecution strategy in maritime murder cases. The 4 weeks between the verdict and sentencing were a period of preparation and reflection for all parties involved. Prosecutor Gonzalez prepared a detailed sentencing memorandum arguing for the maximum sentence on all counts, life without parole on the murder charge, plus 165 years on the remaining counts, to run consecutively rather than concurrently. The memorandum included letters from 47 people who had known Sasha, including teachers, classmates, family members, and the director of the Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center, where she had volunteered, all describing her positive impact on their lives and the loss the world had suffered with her death. Jennifer Mitchell spent the weeks preparing her victim impact statement, working with a victim advocate from the U.S. Attorney's Office to organize her thoughts and emotions into a coherent narrative that would convey to the judge the magnitude of the harm Thomas had inflicted. The defense filed its own sentencing memorandum asking for leniency, arguing that Thomas had no prior criminal history, that he had cooperated with investigators by confessing, and that he had shown remorse, though this last claim was undermined by the fact that Thomas had never once apologized to Jennifer or acknowledged the full extent of his responsibility. The sentencing hearing on February 26, 2024, began at 9:05 a.m. in Judge Hernandez's courtroom, which was once again packed to capacity with spectators, reporters, and supporters of the Mitchell family. The judge began by allowing Prosecutor Gonzalez to make her sentencing recommendation, and Gonzalez delivered a 23-minute statement arguing that Thomas Henn represented the worst kind of criminal, someone who had exploited the trust of his family for personal gain and who had murdered a child to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. She detailed the aggravating factors, the vulnerability of the victim, the brutality of the crime, the premeditation evidenced by Thomas's internet searches, and the betrayal of a position of trust. Gonzalez concluded by asking Judge Hernandez to impose the maximum sentence allowed under federal sentencing guidelines, ensuring that Thomas would die in prison and never have the opportunity to harm anyone else. Greenberg responded with a much shorter statement, arguing that while Thomas's crimes were serious, he was still a human being deserving of some measure of mercy, and that a sentence that provided for the possibility of eventual release would better serve the interests of justice than a sentence that offered no hope of redemption. Judge Hernandez then invited victim impact statements, and Jennifer Mitchell was the first to speak. She walked to the podium set up in front of the judge's bench, carrying a folder containing her written statement. But when she began to speak, she set the folder aside and spoke from her heart. "Your Honor, my daughter Sasha was the light of my life, Jennifer began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She was smart and kind, and so full of hope for the future. She wanted to make the world better, to protect animals and clean up the environment. She believed in justice and doing the right thing, even when it was hard. That's why she confronted Thomas about the money he stole from me. She could have stayed silent, could have looked the other way, but that wasn't who she was. She was brave, and that bravery got her killed. Jennifer paused, her hands gripping the edges of the podium, and when she continued, her voice was filled with rage. Thomas Henn didn't just kill my daughter. He murdered the man I thought I married. He murdered my trust in people. He murdered my sense of security. Every day I wake up and have to face the reality that the man I let into our lives, the man I trusted to be a father to Sasha, beat her to death with a piece of furniture because she was going to expose his crimes. He valued money more than her life. He is not human. He is a monster. Jennifer's statement continued for 14 more minutes, and by the end there was not a single person in the courtroom who was not affected by her words. She described the pain of identifying Sasha's body in the Miami-Dade County morgue, the horror of learning that her husband was the killer, the impossibility of moving forward when every memory of the previous 18 months was now tainted by the knowledge of Thomas's deception. She talked about the financial devastation of having to repay the money Thomas had stolen and defaulted on, the credit card debts he had left behind, the legal fees she had incurred. She spoke about the loneliness of her new reality, a widow twice over, her daughter murdered, her trust destroyed, and she concluded with a direct address to Thomas, who sat at the defense table with his head bowed. "You didn't just kill my daughter. You murdered the man I thought I married. I hope you spend every single day for the rest of your life thinking about what you did, thinking about the brilliant young woman you destroyed, thinking about how you threw away everything good for money that wasn't even yours. I hope you never know a moment of peace. I hope you die alone and forgotten in a prison cell." Jennifer's final words echoed in the silent courtroom, and as she returned to her seat, Judge Hernandez nodded solemnly, clearly moved by the statement. Several other people gave victim impact statements, including Sasha's maternal grandmother, who described the joy Sasha had brought to her life and the devastation of outliving her granddaughter. Sasha's best friend, Rebecca Chen, who had received the final text message, gave a tearful statement about the guilt she felt for not taking the message more seriously, for going to sleep instead of calling the police, and the what-ifs that haunted her. 3 of Sasha's teachers from Coral Gables Senior High School spoke about her academic excellence, her environmental activism, and the potential the world had lost. The director of the Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center described Sasha's dedication and passion, noting that she had volunteered more than 200 hours over the past year and had been instrumental in raising funds for a new rescue facility. By the time the victim impact statements concluded, more than 90 minutes had passed, and the emotional weight in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Judge Hernandez called a brief recess, and when the hearing resumed 20 minutes later, it was time for Thomas to make a statement before sentencing. Thomas Henn rose from his seat at the defense table and walked to the podium, his movements slow and mechanical, like a man walking to his own execution. He was wearing an orange jail jumpsuit, as he had been denied the right to wear civilian clothes for sentencing after attempting to smuggle a razor blade into the courtroom during the verdict reading, an incident that had resulted in additional security measures. Thomas stood silently for a long moment, staring down at the podium, before finally looking up at Judge Hernandez. "Your Honor, I want to say that I am deeply sorry for what I did," Thomas began, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "I know that nothing I say can bring Sasha back or undo the harm I've caused. I wish I could take it back. I wish I had made different choices. I was desperate and scared, and I made the worst mistake of my life." It was a carefully rehearsed statement, designed to express remorse without actually taking full responsibility. And Judge Hernandez's expression made clear that she was not impressed. Thomas continued for another 3 minutes, offering vague apologies and attempting to explain his actions as the result of psychological pressure and poor judgment. He claimed that he had loved Sasha like his own daughter, a statement that caused Jennifer Mitchell to let out a bitter laugh of disbelief from her seat in the gallery. He said that he would spend the rest of his life thinking about what he had done and trying to become a better person, though he offered no specifics about how he planned to achieve this transformation. When Thomas finished and sat down, the courtroom was silent and Judge Hernandez's face showed disgust. She made notes on her legal pad for several minutes before beginning her sentencing remarks, and when she finally spoke, her voice was hard and unyielding. "Mr. Henn, I have presided over criminal cases for 23 years, and I have sentenced murderers, rapists, drug dealers, and white-collar criminals," Judge Hernandez began. "But I have never encountered a defendant whose crimes were as cold-blooded and calculated as yours. You systematically defrauded the woman who loved you. You stole money that was meant to provide security for her and her daughter, and when you were confronted with evidence of your crimes, you murdered a 17-year-old girl to cover them up." Judge Hernandez spent the next 17 minutes detailing the aggravating factors that justified the maximum sentence. She noted that Thomas had been in a position of trust as Sasha's stepfather, that he had exploited that position to commit fraud, and that he had betrayed that trust in the most horrific way possible by murdering her. She noted the premeditation evidenced by his internet searches and his research into countries without extradition treaties, proving that he had been planning either murder or flight for weeks before the cruise. She noted the brutality of the crime, the fact that Sasha had been conscious and aware during part of the beating, that she had fought back and scratched her killer, that she had died slowly and painfully over the course of several minutes. She noted the attempts to obstruct justice, including hiding Sasha's body, disposing of evidence, creating false alibis, and lying repeatedly to investigators. And she noted Thomas's complete lack of genuine remorse, his self-centered focus on his own fate rather than the harm he had caused to Sasha and Jennifer. "You have shown this court that you are a danger to society, that you are incapable of telling the truth, and that you value your own comfort over the lives of others," Judge Hernandez said, her voice rising with anger. "You do not deserve leniency, and you will not receive it from this court." Judge Hernandez then proceeded to sentencing, reading each count aloud and imposing sentence for each. "On count 1, first-degree murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Thomas's head dropped forward, but he showed no other reaction. "On count 2, felony murder, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole to run concurrently with count 1. The judge continued through all 13 counts, imposing significant prison terms on each, and then announced that the sentences on counts 3 through 13 would run consecutively rather than concurrently, adding 25 years to the life sentence. The total sentence is life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus 25 consecutive years, Judge Hernandez announced. "You will be remanded to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve your sentence at a facility designated by the BOP. You have the right to appeal this conviction and sentence within 14 days, though I will note that this court finds the evidence of your guilt to be overwhelming and the sentence to be well within federal guidelines. This court is adjourned." Judge Hernandez banged her gavel once, and bailiffs immediately moved to take Thomas into custody. As Thomas was led from the courtroom in handcuffs and shackles, Jennifer Mitchell stood and shouted the words that would become the headline in dozens of newspapers the next day. "You didn't just kill my daughter, you murdered the man I thought I married." Her voice was raw with pain and fury, and Thomas flinched as though he had been struck, but he did not turn around or respond. He was escorted through a side door and disappeared from public view, beginning a journey that would take him to the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, a high-security federal prison where he would spend the rest of his natural life. The courtroom erupted in applause as the door closed behind Thomas, and this time, Judge Hernandez did not call for order, instead gathering her files and leaving the bench, her work complete. Prosecutor Maria Gonzalez embraced Jennifer Mitchell, and the two women stood together for several minutes, crying tears of relief and grief, surrounded by family members and supporters who had filled the courtroom throughout the 3-week trial. The press conference on the courthouse steps 30 minutes after sentencing was attended by more than 50 reporters from local, national, and international media outlets. Prosecutor Gonzalez stood at a podium bearing the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice, with Jennifer Mitchell standing beside her, and she delivered a brief statement praising the work of the FBI investigative team, the forensic experts who had analyzed the evidence, and the jury who had deliberated carefully and reached the correct verdict. Today, justice was served for Sasha Mitchell, Gonzalez said, her voice carrying across the plaza. Thomas Henn will spend the rest of his life in federal prison, ensuring that he can never harm anyone else. This case demonstrates that no one is above the law, that betraying the trust of your family and murdering a child to cover your crimes will result in the severest punishment our justice system can impose. I want to thank Special Agent John Belmont and his team at the FBI's Miami field office for their outstanding investigative work, and I want to thank Jennifer Mitchell for her courage in testifying against the man who murdered her daughter. This has been one of the most difficult cases of my career, but I am satisfied that we achieved justice for Sasha. Jennifer Mitchell then stepped to the podium to make her own statement, and her words were measured but filled with emotion. I want to thank Prosecutor Gonzalez and everyone at the U.S. Attorney's Office for fighting so hard for Sasha, Jennifer said. I want to thank the FBI for their thorough investigation, and I want to thank the jury for seeing through Thomas's lies and holding him accountable. My daughter was an amazing person, and she deserved so much better than what happened to her. She deserved to go to Duke University, to pursue her dreams of environmental law, to fall in love and have children and grow old. Thomas Henn took all of that away from her and from me, and I will never forgive him. But I can take some comfort in knowing that he will die in prison, that he will never be free again, that every day for the rest of his life he will wake up in a cell and remember what he did. Jennifer paused, wiping tears from her eyes, and then continued. I want Sasha to be remembered not as a murder victim, but as a hero who stood up for what was right, who tried to protect her mother from a predator, who was brave in the face of evil. That's who my daughter was, and that's how I will remember her. The months following Thomas Henn's sentencing saw several developments in the case. Thomas filed a notice of appeal on March 11, 2024, arguing that his conviction should be overturned because the interrogation video should have been suppressed, and because the jury instructions on premeditation were improper. The appeal was assigned to a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, and oral arguments were scheduled for September 2024. Legal experts predicted that the appeal would be denied, as the interrogation had been conducted properly, and the jury instructions had tracked federal pattern instructions used in thousands of cases. Jennifer Mitchell filed a civil lawsuit against Thomas and his estate in May 2024, seeking to recover the $400,000 he had stolen, plus damages for emotional distress, pain, and suffering, and punitive damages. The lawsuit was largely symbolic, as Thomas had no significant assets beyond the offshore account, which had already been frozen and would be subject to forfeiture proceedings. But Jennifer's attorney explained that the lawsuit was about holding Thomas accountable in every possible venue, ensuring that he could never profit from his crimes in any way. The case had lasting impact on cruise ship security protocols and federal maritime law. In June 2024, the major cruise lines announced new security measures in response to the Hen case, including increased camera coverage in crew corridors and service areas, mandatory daily cabin checks for all passengers, including minors, and enhanced training for security staff on recognizing signs of domestic violence and financial crimes. The FBI's Miami field office used the case as a training example for its Maritime Crimes Unit. And Special Agent John Belmont was promoted to Assistant Special Agent in charge of the office in recognition of his outstanding work on the investigation. Prosecutor Maria Gonzalez received the Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service in Criminal Prosecution, the Department of Justice's highest honor for trial attorneys, and she went on to try 14 more cases with a perfect conviction record before retiring in 2027. Judge Roberta Hernandez, who announced her retirement from the bench in 2025, later said that the Hen case was one of the most disturbing and memorable cases of her long judicial career, and that she had never regretted imposing the maximum sentence. Sasha Mitchell's memory was honored in multiple ways by her family, friends, and community. Coral Gables Senior High School established the Sasha Mitchell Environmental Science Scholarship, providing $5,000 annually to a graduating senior pursuing studies in marine biology, environmental law, or related fields. The Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center, where Sasha had volunteered, named their new rescue facility the Sasha Mitchell Sea Turtle Conservation Center, funded in part by donations that poured in from around the world after her murder. Duke University, where Sasha had been accepted for the fall 2023 semester, created a memorial fund in her name to support students studying environmental policy. Jennifer Mitchell channeled her grief into activism, becoming a spokeswoman for organizations that support families of murder victims and working to reform federal maritime law to close loopholes that had made Thomas believe he could get away with his crimes. In 2025, she testified before a congressional committee considering legislation to enhance penalties for crimes committed on cruise ships, and the resulting bill, known informally as Sasha's Law, was signed into law in November 2025. Thomas Hen's life in federal prison was everything Judge Hernandez had intended when she imposed the maximum sentence. He was housed in a single-occupancy cell at USP Terre Haute, a facility known for its harsh conditions and high-security protocols. He was classified as a high-risk inmate due to the nature of his crimes and the notoriety of his case, which meant he spent 23 hours a day in his cell with only 1 hour for recreation in a small outdoor cage. Other inmates, many of whom were fathers themselves, viewed him with contempt for having murdered his stepdaughter, and he was attacked twice during his first year, requiring medical treatment both times. Prison psychologists who evaluated him annually noted that he showed signs of severe depression and continued to maintain that his actions had been driven by circumstances beyond his control, never accepting full responsibility for his choices. He filed multiple grievances complaining about his treatment, the quality of the food, and the restrictions on his communication with the outside world, but all were denied. His appeal was rejected by the 11th Circuit in November 2024, and the Supreme Court declined to hear his case in March 2025, exhausting his direct appeals and leaving him with only the remote possibility of a habeas corpus petition based on claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. Jennifer Mitchell's journey toward healing was long and painful, marked by therapy, support groups, and the gradual reconstruction of a life shattered by betrayal and loss. She sold the home she had shared with Thomas, unable to bear living in the space where he had pretended to be a loving husband while plotting to steal from her and ultimately murdering her daughter. She moved to a small apartment near the ocean, finding some comfort in the sound of waves and the knowledge that Sasha had loved the sea. She attended every parole hearing and appeal proceeding related to Thomas's case, ensuring that prosecutors and judges never forgot about Sasha and the horror of what had been done to her. She began dating again in 2026, tentatively opening her heart to the possibility of trust and love, though she acknowledged that she would never fully recover from the trauma of what Thomas had done. In interviews with journalists and true crime podcasters, Jennifer spoke candidly about her experience, hoping that her story would help other women recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and manipulation in relationships. "I thought I knew Thomas," she said in a 2025 interview with Dateline NBC. "I thought he was kind and trustworthy, but I was wrong. He was a monster wearing a mask of humanity. And I will spend the rest of my life wondering how I didn't see it, how I didn't protect my daughter from him." The legacy of United States versus Thomas Henn endures as one of the most compelling true crime cases of the early 21st century, studied in law schools, featured in dozens of true crime documentaries and podcasts, and cited in legal briefs arguing for stricter sentencing in cases of domestic homicide. The case demonstrated the power of thorough investigation, the importance of forensic science in modern criminal prosecution, and the devastating consequences of financial crimes that escalate into violence. It showed that even seemingly perfect families can harbor dark secrets, that trust can be weaponized by predators, and that the pursuit of money can lead to the destruction of everything truly valuable in life. And it honored the memory of Sasha Mitchell, a courageous young woman who died trying to do the right thing, whose final act was to leave evidence that would bring her killer to justice, and whose legacy lives on in the scholarships, conservation centers, and laws that bear her name. Thomas Henn may have stolen Sasha's future, but he could not erase her impact on the world. And as Jennifer Mitchell said at her daughter's memorial service in March 2023, "Sasha's light was bright enough to illuminate the darkness Thomas brought into our lives, and that light will continue to shine long after he has been forgotten in his prison cell.